Hello, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be the first panelist today. I'll try not to repeat well-known facts. We all understand that tourism brings positive and negative impacts for local communities and that unplanned levels of tourism development often lead to adverse outcomes. I would prefer to allocate the valuable time of our meeting to share with you some fresh insights on evaluating the impacts of tourism development based on our research findings and the simple or sometimes complex methodologies we apply. We are doing many research projects on the impacts of tourism. In brief, we have found that tourism has direct and indirect impacts on residents' health. For me, the most interesting topic is the positive health impacts of tourism. One of our studies conducted in Spain showed that the growth in tourism arrivals negatively influenced residents' health in the short term and had positive effects on health in the long term. We have also uncovered significant effects of tourism development on residents' well-being. And again, they are mostly negative in the short term, but tourism may bring significant positive effects on residents' happiness in the long term. Therefore, it's important to differentiate the short-term and long-term impacts of tourism, which is difficult to do without conducting longitudinal studies. It's essential to recognize that in addition to indirect effects through income, environmental outcomes, access to healthcare, and so on, tourism has significant and direct effects on health and well-being through positive and negative emotions, chronic stress, novelty, social interactions, and some other underexplored mechanisms. Given that health and well-being are among the most important values in human life, I assert that in addition to economic impacts, every destination should measure the social, cultural, environmental, and psychological impacts of tourism on local communities. Another question is how to measure these impacts. This is the statistical framework for measuring the sustainability of tourism that is currently discussed by the UNWTO expert group and will be presented to the United Nations Statistical Commission. It includes new environmental impacts like water flows, energy flows, ecosystem services, and so on, and new social indicators, civic engagement, accessibility, safety, and so on. It will be great to establish a system of environmental and social indicators in addition to economic input-output analysis metrics. However, we know that we often lack this data on the local levels. And to be honest, I'm afraid we'll always lack this data. I suggest that the easiest way to measure the impacts of tourism on the local level is to ask local people. It's more cost-effective, it provides deeper insights, and it's more meaningful for local communities. And the easiest way to do this is through resident surveys, interviews, and social media analytics. You may be surprised, but residents' perceptions of tourism development often differ significantly from the real impacts. Even on the global scale, we compared the levels of air pollution with subjective levels of satisfaction with air quality and found significant differences between objective indicators and residents' perceptions. On the local level, residents' perceptions of tourism impacts depend on community attachment, personal involvement, socio-demographic and personal characteristics, and many other factors. Furthermore, residents' perceptions of tourism impacts are more important than the real impacts, as they influence their evaluations of life satisfaction and contribute to resident support for tourism development. We recently developed and validated a scale to measure a resident's perceptions of tourism impacts that can be used at any tourism destination. You can see its simplified version includes only 8 questions, and the simplest approach is to ask local people the same questions every year to see the dynamics of their perceptions. Another opportunity is to use social media analytics. I've been analyzing data on people's attitudes toward tourism in the US on a daily basis since the beginning of COVID, and I can clearly see changes in positive and negative sentiment after each crisis, spikes in news coverage, or governmental actions. Nowadays, it's not so difficult to monitor residents' sentiment toward tourism on a local level using social media listening platforms. Next, each tourism practices, policies, and programs should be implemented only after pretesting them with the help of experiments. Each time when we hear that spending an additional $1 million for destination management programs has resulted in improved economic, social, and well-being outcomes, it's not quite accurate. These positive outcomes can be influenced by various external factors, such as the end of COVID, the overall economic situation, new sentiment, seasonality, people's mood while answering questions due to good weather, and so on. Only experiments make it possible to evaluate and pretest the real impacts of each sustainable practice or community innovation. It's also simple, but it's essential to randomly assign people to several groups, including a control group, and only then implement practices or interventions for the experimental group and measure the outcomes. And here I see a broad application of the behavioral insights, an inductive approach to policy making that combines insights from psychology, cognitive science, social science, economics with empirically tested results. Again, without experiments, it's impossible to pretest or evaluate program effectiveness and understand the cause and effect relationships between tourism development programs and the impacts of tourism. And my final point for today. Tourism destination is a complex system that includes residents, tourists, providers, governments, DMOs, non-profit organizations, and so on. Let's suppose that this is our community graph on the screen. After analyzing the structure, it can be simplified for usability. And through network analysis, we can clearly see the numbers describing each destination stakeholders, the main players, connections between them, bridges, clusters, influencers, communities, and so on. This will help destinations to understand the structure of destination communities, gather and disseminate information, and evaluate the impacts of tourism on different destination stakeholders. So, to sum up, first, we must continually measure the perceived impacts of tourism at any tourism destination. In addition to objective measures, the easiest tools we can use to evaluate the impacts of tourism on the local level are survey scales, residence interviews, and social media analytics. Next, residents' perceptions of tourism are much easier to measure, but at the same time, they are more important in influencing residents' well-being and their support for tourism development. Network analysis could help us to understand the structure of the main destination community stakeholders and their relationships. Each destination governance organization should have this network graph available. And finally, all tourism policies and practices should be pretested using experimental design and should only be implemented after evaluating their effectiveness and maximizing the impacts on local communities. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be happy to share any additional insights.